The courage to believe in our own stories. Writing is a lonely profession. Most of the time, we are working in solitude, holding stories in our heads, and then taking them from our minds onto paper, making the world and those stories as real for others as they were for us. Somewhere along this process begins the infernal cycle of submissions and rejections. We take these stories that we have lovingly crafted and spent years building, we take these stories to the gatekeepers of the literary world, to people who we believe will unlock the commercial potential of our stories, or people we believe hold the power to decide whether the story belongs in the pages of a literary journal, whether the story is accepted or rejected. As writers, we are a resilient bunch. We pride ourselves in our courage in the face of rejections. We pride ourselves in our ability to bounce back very swiftly from rejections. When we get one rejection, we write another story, or we take the story to another editor. However, I wouldn't be lying every time someone rejects a part of our story or a story. Something inside us begins to doubt the worth of our story. The narrative in our head goes something like this. We ask ourselves, editors read thousands of stories per month. Surely they know what's a good story, what's a bad story. So if my story is not resonating with them, that means there's something wrong with it. Something needs to be fixed. A couple of years ago, I wrote a story called Ifat Khala. It was set in Lahore. It came from a very personal space. The story was told through the voice of a narrator who's a young girl, and she's looking at the life of her aunt change. She doesn't always understand why her aunt's life has changed so drastically, but she records those changes through her child's voice. The story is a comment on social attitudes towards female impotence in Pakistan. I sent the story out to several publications. It was rejected 45 times. Every time a rejection would come, I would doubt a different part of the story. For the first 5 rejections, I thought there was something wrong with the title of the story. I thought the word khala might have been confusing for them. I thought maybe they were put off by it. Maybe they didn't understand it. Maybe they didn't know how to pronounce it. So part of me said, should I change it to Aunt Ifat? But Aunt Ifat was not at all how I had intended for the story to sound. So I stuck with Ifat Khala. One of the editors wrote back saying that the name and the age of the narrator were missing from the story, and that she would have liked to have those details included in the story. I found that very strange because the name of the narrator was completely irrelevant to the story. And for me, it was an insensitive reading of the story because I did not understand how the elements of the story were working together and serving my end as a writer in the story. As for the age of the narrator, I had intended for the age of the narrator to be clear, not through my statement of the age, but through the story's tone. And I had aimed for it to be clear in the first sentence. So stating those elements overtly within the story seemed not just irrelevant and redundant, but possibly a very serious distraction. Another feedback I got was that the story was way too long, that it needed to be clipped down and trimmed to half its present length. The comments specifically said that the descriptions of afternoons, the descriptions of children playing in summer afternoon on the rooftop were redundant, and they needed to be trimmed and edited. The story, they felt, should be trimmed to half its size. I had intended to portray the languor of a summer afternoon and the leisure of children playing on a rooftop because I wanted that by the end of the story, when those elements were gone, I wanted the reader to feel a lingering sense of loss, which felt like a loss of innocence. So the descriptions stayed. I guess I had spent so much time with the story in my head that by the time it got out into and onto paper, it felt settled, it felt ready. I was ready to fight for the story. After about 8 months, I was almost convinced that I was delusional, like most authors are, everyone knows. The story wasn't meant to be. It wasn't as good as I thought it was. It was perhaps time to move on. One day, I got a quiet mail in my inbox. No exclamation marks, no capitals, just quiet 2 sentences. All our editorial team loved your story. We would be honored to feature it in our spring edition. This was from a journal I really respect and look up to. Well, what do you know? Someone did understand the story. So the story was good enough. Why can't we remember this all the time? Why do we begin to doubt the worth of our stories when they go through the circles of publishing and gatekeeping? Here's the thing. There's always going to be somebody who wants our stories to be not what we want our stories to be, but what they want our stories to be. They want our stories to suit their expectations of our stories. And their expectations of our stories are built on worldviews which are very narrow and limited, because they are unable to read our stories with empathy and responsibility. They want those stories to mold. They want the stories to be digestible. A little more terrorism, please. A little more women in oppression, please. Your story is too Pakistani. Your story is not Pakistani enough. Can you remove these descriptions because they're idle? Who writes 2 pages about summer afternoons in Lahore? Nobody has the right to make these calls for me, to make these calls for us when we write our stories. Today, I want to write a story which is set in Pakistan, and I'm convinced about that story. So I will write a story which is set in Pakistan. Tomorrow, if I want to write historical fiction, I will, with equal conviction, write a story which is set in another place and in another time. Nobody should tell us what to write and how to write. If there is a story that you're convinced about, if there's a story that we believe in our bones is a story we are meant to tell, it's our responsibility towards ourselves as creators. It's our responsibility towards our gifts and our craft to renew courage in those stories, to practice the act of placing faith in those stories, to fight for those stories. That daily rehearsal of courage, that daily renewal of courage will show up as strength in our writing. So are those moments of doubt gone? Do I not experience them anymore? Of course I do. Every time I pitch a book, every time I pitch a poem, every time I pitch a story, and I get a no, I still doubt myself. But I doubt myself a lot less because I have honed my craft and I know that I need much fewer words than before to create the same impact. I have also had a lot more acceptances than rejections, so I'm more confident than before. And if doubt ever begins to creep in, I always tell myself, it's not a big deal. After all, with Ifat Khala, I got 46th time lucky. Thank you.